Hi everybody. From Please Please Me right through to the White Album, all of the Beatles albums were released in two different versions, mono and stereo. I'm going to be comparing each version of each album and saying which is my favourite and why. I'm going to be giving them a score so that we can see an overall ranking as well. If you've not hit the subscribe button yet, please do so, then you'll get to see my future videos and probably some of my past ones as well. And if you've got any comments about any of the things I'm going to discuss, then please let me know down below. So first up, the debut album from 1963, Please Please Me. Now with a lot of these albums, I got to know them in stereo for many years before I became familiar with the mono versions. And I did love the stereo versions of the albums, but once I got to know this, it became clear that there's so much more power in the songs here in mono. Now, I've heard interviews with George Martin where he's described how in the early days of the Beatles, when stereo was really a sort of a new technology, how because a lot of the people at the time who were getting stereo systems, it was often those sort of hi-fi systems where everything was in one box and the speakers were often really close to each other. So in order to be able to sort of sell the idea of having stereo, they had to have every sort of half of everything on one side and half of everything on the other, creating this big panning effect with nothing in the middle. And it was really so that the technology of the day could actually sort of give the listener an experience of there being some stereo separation. So on more modern equipment, I know that can sound really harsh, but I completely understand the reason why they were doing this back in the day. But yeah, the mono version has a lot more power here. And there's a really weird thing on the stereo version of Please Please Me, the song Please Please Me, the last sort of 10 seconds or so. It's really noticeable on the 2009 remasters of the album. It just goes really, really sort of echoey and really strange sounding, whereas this keeps its focus all the way through. So I'm going to give for each album, I've got 20 points available and I'm going to split them accordingly, and for Please Please Me I'm giving 11 points to the mono and 9 points to the stereo. From later on in 1963, it's the second album with the Beatles. Now, when the Beatles albums were originally released on CD back in 1987, this is one of the albums where they actually gave us the mono version then, and it wasn't until 2009 that we got the stereo version on CD for the first time. And Money, the song Money right at the end, on the stereo version, which is in that box set there, when the guitar comes in at the beginning of that song, that is absolutely incredible, and it's a real plus point for the stereo version of the album. But overall, the mono really sort of really destroys the stereo version of the album. Again, it's got so much more power, more focus to it, and it is much better. I'm actually going to redress the balance on the points a bit because of Money and just how great that guitar intro is on the stereo version. So it would have been 12-8 to mono, but because of that Money, I'm giving it 11 again to the mono version and 9 for the stereo version. From 1964, it's A Hard Day's Night. And whilst I'm not going to go into detail throughout this about every little difference between mono and stereo, there's some things that just can't be ignored. And the main song on here that has to be talked about is If I Fell. So in mono, it just destroys the stereo version completely. So even right from the very start of the song. And the stereo, you've got John's singing intro, sort of double tracks, but it doesn't really hold together brilliantly. It's the timings of it's not great. Whereas in mono, you've just got John's voice on its own, and it sounds really good. And then towards the back end of the song, where Paul sings "Was in Vain," in the stereo version, it just cuts off completely, and you don't even hear him singing all of it. Now, in the mono version, that's not perfect either, because Paul's voice is sort of quite cracked and breaks up a bit, but at least you hear him singing it, and it's real. Stereo, just cut off completely. Now, one thing I will say for the stereo version of this album is that I think Can't Buy Me Love sounds really good on stereo, and probably better than the mono version. It's just got a lot more energy, and that sounds really great. But overall, really the mono version is the go-to, I think, for this album, and I'm giving that 12 points to stereo's 8. Okay, before we move on to the next album, it's worth just pointing out for anybody who doesn't know, I'm sure a lot of you will, that when it came to mixing the albums originally, what George Martin and the Beatles concentrated on more than anything was always the mono versions. They would put a lot of time into creating those mono mixes, and the stereo versions were often kind of an afterthought, just sort of, let's do those in an afternoon and get those mixed, so that there often wasn't, in the early days, the same care and attention went into the stereo mixers. But anyway, moving on to the next album, Beatles For Sale, from the back end of 1964. This is where it starts to get interesting for me and not quite as clear cut. The mono version of the album is superb. Let's not make any mistakes about that. But stereo, this feels like the first stereo album to me where it wasn't created for the novelty value of trying to show what stereo can do, and I think the stereo version of this sort of really works well in its own right. Now, at the start of I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, if you listen to that in stereo and mono, there's an electric guitar part at the start. I presume it's George that played it. It's so buried in the mix on the mono version, but it's really prominent in stereo, and I think that helps the song because it's supposed to be there and it's a good part of the song. So this, for me, I'm going to actually give it a draw, 10 points each for Beatles For Sale, because although the mono version is still superb, they've really nailed it with the stereo version as well on this one, and they're really learning how to do those properly by this point. Okay, moving into 1965 now, and Help. So there's a lot of great things to say about both the mono and the stereo versions of this album. The stereo version's got much more clarity, I think, to each sort of individual element of the mix. The mono mix for me can sometimes be a little sort of muddy, as though things are getting in the way of each other a little bit. But it's still superb. It still sounds real and sounds like you're listening to 1965. But that stereo mix, I do really love it, and I would probably have given it a draw, 10 points each, had it not been for one particular song on this album, and that's Yesterday. The first time I heard Yesterday in mono, I thought I was going to fall off my seat. It is just incredible. It's stripped back of any of the reverb that's on the stereo version, and it feels like Paul McCartney's just walked into your room and is singing it directly to you. So for Yesterday alone, that tips the balance for me in the favour of the mono version. So I'm giving 11 points to mono and 9 for stereo, but a great stereo version. Moving on to Rubber Soul. This is the easiest decision that there's going to be in this whole video. No doubt about it. If you listen to Rubber Soul in mono, on a good turntable, through a good setup, this is one of the greatest things. It's just absolutely phenomenal, the mono version. It's just got so much power. It feels so real. And when you compare it to the stereo version, it's lovely, it's great. It's Rubber Soul, for God's sake. But it's just not got the impact that this has got. This mono destroys the stereo in every possible way. And I'm giving it 13 points for the mono and 7 for the stereo. 1966, Revolver. This is where things start changing for me. I think the stereo version is probably the one that I would pick more than mono. The mono version, again, it's great, but a bit like Help, I think there's a little bit of muddiness in the mono mix where each individual element just sort of seems to be affected by everything else around it and not having its clarity to sort of stand on its own. And I would really love a remix of Revolver in the way that we've had in the last few years from Giles Martin. I think this could really benefit from it, to be honest. But in stereo, the main things, and this is, we're getting into the sort of realms here of there being quite a few differences between the albums in terms of the way that they're mixed and how things come in. But the main things that I would pick up on stereo is She Said, She Said. The drums on the intro, when the drums come in, it's just got so much more punch on the stereo version. And Tomorrow Never Knows as well. I mean, it's a work of art whether you listen to it in mono, stereo, or whatever you listen to it on. But I think Ringo's snare and his toms just have got that much more punch on the stereo version. So for Revolver, it's a win for stereo. I'm giving it 12 points to 8 for the mono. 1967. For me, the greatest album that's ever been made in history. Sgt Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. John Lennon famously said, "You've never heard Sgt Pepper unless you've heard it in mono." Now, for years, this is another one where I really only knew the stereo version for decades, and until I recently, in the last few years, got hold of the mono set. And I now sort of realise just the power of the mono version of it and just how great that is. So some of the key differences that I've picked out that sort of highlight how great the mono is. Firstly, on Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, the vocal effects on John are much more pronounced on the mono version than they are in stereo, and that's always, it sort of helps that sort of dreamy quality of the song. She's Leaving Home, massive difference between the two versions. So on the stereo version, which I actually like the stereo version of She's Leaving Home, they slowed the tape down. So it's sort of lowered Paul's voice from being sort of quite high. It all of a sudden sort of sounds slower and a bit more dreamy. But I like the sort of, it's like a melancholy effect that you get. And I do really like that. So I sort of tend to prefer She's Leaving Home in stereo. But then towards the back end of the album as well, when you've got Sgt Pepper's the reprise version. So on stereo, you hear the crowd come back in that had been there at the start during all the Billy Shears section. You hear them come back in, but they do something on the mono version, and I have no idea whether it was an accident, deliberate, or what. But you actually hear them. They sort of switch on the crowd noise. It's as though the crowd noise is on a tape, and the switching the tape on it goes whoosh. And I absolutely love that, the fact that it doesn't sound like a real crowd, but they've added it. Fantastic. So for Sgt Pepper, the mono version's got such power, and I'm giving that 11 points over 9 for the stereo, but I do really love the stereo version as well. I love every version of this album. It's Sgt Pepper, man. Come on. Later in 1967, in the Summer of Love, it's Magical Mystery Tour. Now, this, for me, is one where whichever version you're listening to, you're going to think it can't be bettered. If you put the mono version on, it is going to blow you away and it's going to sound fantastic. If you put the stereo version on, you're going to think this is amazing. So for me, this is one where I think both copies are essential, really. Now, the main difference that I picked out between the two is on the song Flying, the mainly instrumental song. And it's the one where it's got the most extreme sort of hard left and hard right panning on the song, like they were doing in the early days, like I said, to create that stereo effect. But I really like it, and I think the reason why I like it is that it ties in perfectly with what's happening in the film at that point where Flying comes in. So they're on the bus tour, and the host, Jimmy Johnson, is saying, if you look on the left, the view is not very inspiring. But if you look to your right, and Flying comes in. So I really like the fact that they've got left and right panning while talking about left and right on the film. I have no idea if it's deliberate or not, but I really like how those two things match up. But both are absolutely essential. Both are magnificent. 10 points each for Magical Mystery Tour. 1968, and the last Beatles studio album where they created a mono and a stereo version. It's the White Album, of course. And for me, again, a bit like with Magical Mystery Tour, both versions are absolutely essential. There is quite a bit of difference on various songs between the two mixes, and really I think you want to have them both in your collection. Now, in theory, I would say that the mono version, sound-wise, has got more punch and is a better listen than the stereo version. But there is one massive, massive advantage to the stereo version that's going to even it all out, and that's on Helter Skelter. And for me, if you're listening to Helter Skelter and Ringo doesn't shout about having blisters on the end of his fingers at the end of the song, then it's not Helter Skelter, and it's not the White Album. And on the mono version, you do not get that, because the song fades out and finishes before you get to that point. And I always just think, I want to hear Ringo at this point. So mono sounds slightly better, I think. Stereo, you get the full effect because of what happens at the end of Helter Skelter. So overall, I'm calling that a draw, 10 points each. But that's not the end of it, because we've also got the Past Masters albums, so created to bring together all the various singles that weren't on albums, B-sides that weren't on albums, a way for you to get really everything that the Beatles released during their time together. The Past Masters album, this is the vinyl version that's got both 1 and 2 in it, and it was then released as mono masters when the Beatles in mono came out in 2009. And it's slightly different track lists between the two, and so it's a bit of a tricky one to compare this. Now, essentially, on the mono version, it absolutely destroys stereo in terms of the sound of it. Especially something like Paperback Writer, that is the absolute highlight of the mono masters. It just absolutely rocks in mono, where it doesn't as much in stereo. Mono version, of course, being what was released as the original single version back in 1966. But there's a problem with this for me, and it is side 5 of 6, where what they did was they included various mono mixes from the Yellow Submarine album, so Only Northern Song Altogether Now, Hey Bulldog and It's All Too Much, and I just feel like they've been added there just to sell copies rather than to make it a better listening experience. You know, the past masters wasn't really designed for things like that, mixes that were never originally released, and I think it takes the focus away from the listening experience for me. So whilst the mono sound-wise destroys stereo, I'm actually redressing the balance a bit because I don't think the track list is as focused on here. But I'm giving 11 points to the mono version and 9 points to the stereo version. So overall, you can see I've given 118 points to the mono version of the albums and 102 to stereo. The mono versions overall are quite considerably the versions to go to. Like I say, if you've got any comments, please let me know down below, and thank you very much for watching. There's some other videos here that might be of interest to you. Cheers, bye bye.